We're taught to believe that police officers are heroes, that behind the badge stands someone who will protect us from danger, someone we can trust when everything else falls apart. But what if that badge was a mask? What if the man upholding the law by day was breaking it in the most horrifying ways by night? This isn't fiction. This isn't a movie. This is a real story of a man who wore a uniform, swore an oath, and then used his position of power to become one of the most sadistic predators in American history. He was a family man, a neighbor, a trusted law enforcement officer. But behind the locked doors of quiet neighborhoods, he unleashed unthinkable terror, committing a string of rapes, murders, and break-ins that haunted California for decades. And the most terrifying part? No one suspected him, because who would ever imagine a police officer could be the monster they were hunting? They called him many names: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. But when the truth finally came out, the world knew him as the Golden State Killer. And the man behind it all was Joseph James DeAngelo, a man who used the law to hide his evil. In this video, we'll take you deep into the mind of a killer disguised as a cop. We'll uncover how he operated undetected for over 40 years, how he manipulated an entire justice system, and how, in the end, the very science he tried to outsmart brought him down. The uniform didn't make him a hero, it gave him cover. Stay with us, because this is the story of the most evil police officer in history, and it's darker than you ever imagined. The mask of authority. It started with a man who looked just like any other cop patrolling the streets in the 1970s. His name? Joseph James DeAngelo. He wasn't just some rookie trying to make his mark. He was a Navy veteran, trained in law enforcement, and eventually worked as a police officer in Exeter and Auburn, California. To the outside world, DeAngelo was the definition of order and discipline. He wore the badge with pride, carried himself like a man of authority, and enforced the law with the confidence of someone who believed in it. But behind that badge was something far more sinister. DeAngelo wasn't just maintaining the peace. He was studying how to destroy it. With every shift, he learned police patterns, response times, how investigations worked, and, most chilling of all, how to avoid getting caught. He was a student of the system he was sworn to uphold, and he used every lesson to plan his crimes. He'd listened to police scanners. He knew how detectives worked, and he always stayed one step ahead. He wasn't a sloppy criminal driven by impulse. He was calculating, precise, and disturbingly patient. What no one knew at the time was that DeAngelo had already begun his reign of terror. While wearing his uniform during the day, he was stalking neighborhoods at night. He'd break into homes, not just to steal, but to observe, to memorize floor plans, to learn the routines of the people inside. And then he'd return. He started small, burglaries that felt random, but they weren't. He was experimenting, building confidence, testing limits. Between 1974 and 1975, Visalia was plagued by more than 100 break-ins. The police were baffled. They had no idea that the man responsible might have been one of their own. But DeAngelo was just getting started. What began as property crime would soon evolve into something much darker, something violent, something sadistic. The mask of authority gave him the perfect cover. He was the last person anyone would suspect, and that was his greatest weapon. A legacy of horror. At first, it was just whispers. A break-in here, a ransacked home there, strange footsteps in the night. Victims would describe hearing someone in the hallway, heavy breathing, the sense of being watched, but there was no trace, no fingerprints, no answers. Then came the escalation. He changed locations, changed tactics, but the signature remained the same: meticulous, cruel, and personal. He wasn't just stealing, he was terrorizing. He would enter homes while families slept, often armed with a gun and a knife. He would tie up the husband, stack dishes on his back, and whisper, "If I hear the move, she dies." And then he would disappear, silent as a shadow, leaving behind shattered lives and a sickening sense of violation. They called him the East Area Rapist, the monster who stalked Sacramento and its suburbs in the late 1970s. He struck over and over, more than 50 women attacked in their own homes. His attacks were planned with military precision. He knew when they'd be alone, He watched them for days, sometimes weeks, and when he came for them, they never saw it coming. But it didn't stop there. The crimes grew darker, deadlier. Somewhere along the way, D'Angelo's thirst for control transformed into a thirst for blood. Between 1979 and 1986, couples began turning up dead in Southern California, bound, bludgeoned, executed. No clear motive, no witnesses, but the method? Unmistakable. The East Area Rapist had changed names and become the original Night Stalker. Same tactics, same sick rituals. But now, he left corpses instead of survivors. And for decades, no one connected the dots. Different jurisdictions, different names, different nightmares. But it was all the same man. Joseph James D'Angelo was playing a long game, killing in silence, disappearing into suburban normalcy, living among the people he'd traumatized, shopping in their grocery stores, waving to neighbors, while the families he destroyed could barely sleep through the night. He had created a legacy, not of fame, not of honor, but of pure, calculated horror. And somehow he was still invisible, the evil within. What kind of mind could live this double life? By day, he was a husband, a father, a former cop. He went to the grocery store. He mowed his lawn. He laughed with his neighbors. By night, he became a ghost, a violent predator stalking women and couples, driven not by desperation, but by power. Joseph James D'Angelo wasn't out of control. He was in complete control. And that's what makes him so terrifying. This wasn't about rage. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about domination, about playing God. He planned everything. He studied his victims. He entered their homes days before the attack, leaving back doors unlocked, unloading guns, disabling lights. Then he waited, like a spider, until the perfect moment. And when he struck, it wasn't quick. It was prolonged, methodical, torturous. He wanted his victims to know they were powerless, to hear him whisper, to beg, to remember every second. He left behind no DNA, no fingerprints, no faces, only fear. And somehow, after each attack, he slipped back into his normal life, unnoticed, unbothered, untouched. Friends described him as quiet. Co-workers called him strict. Some even said he had a temper, but no one imagined he could be capable of the things he did. But there were cracks. He had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting, a pathetic, careless crime that seemed beneath someone so meticulous. But even then, no one suspected what he truly was. Psychologists now believe D'Angelo suffered from antisocial personality disorder, a man incapable of empathy, incapable of remorse. He didn't kill because he had to, he killed because he could. He was addicted to the thrill, the feeling of control, the terror in his victims' eyes, and the knowledge that no one could catch him. The mask he wore wasn't just a disguise, it was part of him. The badge, the family, the house on a quiet street. It was all camouflage. But evil like his doesn't stay buried forever. The Fall. For over 4 decades, the monster lived free. He had terrorized communities, destroyed families, and vanished without a trace. Cold case after cold case piled up, leads faded, detectives retired, and still, he remained in the shadows, untouched by justice. But time has a way of catching even the most careful predator. Joseph D'Angelo believed he was smarter than everyone else. He had watched the system from the inside. He knew how to cover his tracks. He thought the nightmare he created would never be tied back to him. He was wrong. In 2018, a group of investigators tried something radical. They turned to a tool D'Angelo never anticipated: genetic genealogy. They uploaded the DNA profile from one of the crime scenes, not to a criminal database, but to a public genealogy site. Within days, they had a partial match, a distant relative. From there, a family tree was built, branch by branch, narrowing the suspect pool until only one name remained: Joseph James D'Angelo. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't on anyone's radar. But when investigators trailed him and collected DNA from a discarded tissue, The results were undeniable. The man who had haunted California for decades had finally been unmasked. When they knocked on his door, he didn't fight. He didn't run. He didn't even speak. Because deep down, he knew his time was up. The arrest sent shockwaves across the country. Survivors who had lived in fear for years were finally able to breathe. Families who had buried loved ones in silence now had a name to blame. The monster was real, and he had been hiding in plain sight. In court, D'Angelo sat silent, frail, motionless, a shadow of the terror he once embodied. He pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnappings. But investigators believe the real number is far higher. His crimes stretch across more than a decade, and many victims may never receive closure. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. There would be no escape this time, no mask to hide behind, no uniform to protect him, just bars, silence, and the ghosts of the people he could never erase. Joseph James D'Angelo, the police officer, the predator, the man who thought he'd outsmart justice, had finally fallen. The impact. Some stories end with justice. But justice doesn't erase the damage. It doesn't rewind time. It doesn't bring back the lives that were stolen or fix the ones that were shattered. The true impact of Joseph James D'Angelo can't be measured in prison sentences or court records. It lives in memory and trauma in the silence that followed each of his crimes. He didn't just hurt people. He changed them. He turned safe homes into crime scenes. He turned peaceful nights into lifelong triggers. Survivors speak of waking up screaming decades later, of locking every window 3 times, of never trusting a quiet street again. Some victims never came forward, some never healed, and some didn't survive. For them, there is no closure, only the chilling knowledge that the man who destroyed their world lived free for most of his life. But it's not just the victims who were affected. D'Angelo's crimes changed the way law enforcement worked. His case revealed how fragmented investigations can let monsters slip through the cracks. One man, under different names, committed dozens of crimes across multiple counties, and it took over 40 years to connect the dots. His case became a symbol, a warning, a call for better communication, better technology, and better support for victims. It also showed the power and controversy of genetic genealogy, the tool that finally caught him open a new era in criminal investigation and a new debate over privacy. But beyond the science, beyond the strategy, was a simple truth. This man wore a badge. He was one of the people we're supposed to trust. And he used that trust as a weapon. That betrayal cuts deeper than any single crime. It forced an entire community to question everything: who we trust, who protects us, and what evil can look like. In the end, Joseph D'Angelo is no longer a mystery. He's a man behind bars, an old, broken figure rotting in a cell. But the fear he caused, the lives he destroyed, those echoes still remain. And maybe they always will. The legacy. When we think of Joseph James D'Angelo, it's easy to focus on the darkness, the horror, the years of terror he inflicted upon families, upon entire communities. He was an East Area rapist. He was the original Night Stalker. He was a man who wore a badge, a man who hid in plain sight, and a man whose very existence challenged the idea that the ones we trust the most can often be the ones most capable of harm. But as the decades passed, his identity remained elusive. His crimes, too great to ignore, were overshadowed by the passage of time. And it's this silence, this eerie, almost suffocating quiet, that has left the deepest scar. His crimes were buried beneath years of unanswered questions, and it took one of the most significant advancements in modern criminal investigation to finally unearth the truth. Joseph D'Angelo's legacy isn't one of fame. It's not one of notoriety in the traditional sense. What he leaves behind is a darker, more chilling mark, a mark of betrayal. The man who pledged to protect, to serve, and to bring justice was the very one who took it away. He became a symbol of the monster that can hide behind any mask, whether the badge, a smile, or a name that's trusted by those around him. The impact of his crimes wasn't just felt in the broken homes, the shattered lives, and the scarred survivors. It rippled out, causing a deep fissure in the very fabric of trust that holds communities together. And that is the most insidious kind of damage. It's the kind of damage that doesn't heal overnight or in a courtroom. It's the damage that lingers in the heart, in the mind, in the everyday moments when the silence gets too loud. The families of his victims live with a legacy of grief and loss that will never fade. But there's also the legacy of resilience, of survival, of courage. And that is the hope in this darkness, that the very people who suffer the most have found strength in the face of the unimaginable. Some have used their pain to push for justice, to fight for the truth to come out, to make sure that their loved ones are remembered, not as victims, but as individuals whose stories deserve to be told. And then there are the detectives, the investigators, the men and women who refuse to let this case slip into obscurity. They work tirelessly, piecing together the smallest clues, keeping the case alive, even when hope seemed to wane. Some of them are gone now, their careers ending long before D'Angelo was caught, but their dedication set the stage for the breakthrough that would eventually close this chapter of terror. In 2018, when the breakthrough came, not through traditional detective work, but through genetic genealogy, it was more than a victory for law enforcement. It was a victory for every victim, every family member, every person whose life had been touched by his evil. It was a victory for technology, for science, and for the world of crime solving that had transformed from archaic methods into something far more sophisticated, far more precise. When Joseph D'Angelo was finally arrested, the country breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the true significance of that moment wasn't just the arrest itself. It wasn't just the image of an old man in a courtroom, pleading guilty to decades of crime. No, the significance wasn't what it represented. Justice delayed, but not denied. It showed that the system, despite its flaws, can still catch up with the monsters who hide in the darkness. But the real story here is not about the capture. It's about the aftermath. It's about the people who live with the aftermath of D'Angelo's actions for so long. The survivors, who now find themselves living the shadow of a new, quieter kind of terror. The families who will never get their loved ones back. The lives that will never return to what they once were. The scars of D'Angelo's legacy don't just lie in the lives he destroyed. They lie in the very way society views safety, trust, and vulnerability. He was a reminder that predators are not always who we expect them to be. They don't always fit the stereotypical image. They are often the ones who walk among us every day, hiding in plain sight, wearing the faces of the people we trust. And yet, in the face of this unimaginable evil, something remarkable happened. The case that haunted the world for over 40 years finally came to a close. Thanks to technology, thanks to persistence, thanks to the voices of those who refused to be silenced, who demanded that justice be served, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. But even with his arrest, his legacy lingers. His actions have changed the way we think about crime and punishment. They've altered the way we use technology in criminal investigations. They've made us more aware of the fragility of trust. And they've reminded us that evil doesn't need to wear a costume or a mask. It can hide behind any identity. D'Angelo's legacy is a paradox. It is one of destruction, but also of resilience. It is one of terror, but also of triumph. And it will continue to shape the way we view crime and justice long after a story has faded from the headlines. So, what's left when the monster is caught? What happens next? The truth is, the conversation doesn't end here. The impact of his crimes doesn't just vanish. But it's up to us, to you, to make sure that these stories continue to be told. To make sure that justice, even when delayed, is never forgotten. To honor the victims, to push for answers, and to never allow the shadows to grow too long. If this story moved you, if it made you think about trust, about justice, about the darkness that can hide in the most unexpected places, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and help spread awareness about the real-life horrors that people face every day. Comment below and share your thoughts. What does D'Angelo's legacy mean to you? How has this case changed the way you view crime and justice? The most terrifying monsters are not the ones we see on the big screen. They're the ones who walk among us, hidden behind a mask of normalcy. But the more we talk about them, the harder it becomes for them to stay hidden. Thank you for watching. Remember, the truth is out there. It's real, and it's up to us to keep searching for it.